met by participation in the extraordinary form of the Mass. I've gone through and changed from rite to form on the basis of what Father Brahman said. So I've changed all that to go along lines, basically going back to what he said. That's right, he's right there. The other theme that I heard was encounter. So the encounter with Christ as at Galilee, hearing the word, hearing the gospel in our own language, as the disciples did at Pentecost, an encounter with the real presence of Christ. Now I take, and I was reflecting a little at the break, Roberto's comment and point about the different senses of presence, and also Dominic's response to that. And I thought we could have a really interesting conversation here about Aquinas' three ways of presence, describing God's presence in the world, in creation, the sanctifying presence, sanctifying grace in the saints, and then the personal union. And I think there's something to be said about the different ways that Christ is present to us, the different ways that God is present to us, even in the context of the Mass, corresponding to those three ways. So I think that would be an interesting thing to think about and talk about a little bit later on. Right, so what stood out to me, the one reflection, the one kind of response that really stood out to me actually as I went away, I listened to these as soon as I got them, and the one that just I mulled over and thought about, and the language of it just kept coming back to me, was actually the one response that didn't refer to the traditional Latin Mass, and didn't refer to the Novus Ordo, but just used the phrase ad orientem. Ad orientem. This was the thing that stood out to this particular lady in her experience of the Mass. And I thought that's really interesting, because it's not about language. It's not about form. It's about something much deeper that corresponds, I think, to what Dominic and I were talking about back in, I don't know, January, March, I don't know when it was we spoke, about thinking about the way in which we experience the Mass being multisensory, being about the way we move and the way we hear, what we see, what we smell, all of those sorts of things. And so I wanted to sit with that response a little bit and think about the different elements of that response. Because I think there's a lot of things that were reflected in that. So she talked about experiencing the Christ as a shepherd, being shepherded through Mass, which I thought was really beautiful, and I'll talk a bit more about that. That it's not a performance, which also I really liked, and I'll talk about the senses of that. Not teaching, though I think teaching is really important. Mass is probably not the time to do that kind of teaching. And the sense of being led. And then finally, which I just thought this is beautiful, that it reminded her of dance class. And I thought there's something for us in that particular reflection of, it reminded me of dance class. I thought that's really fantastic. So first, the idea of being shepherded. Now, this is a beautiful image that it resonates with me, particularly as a catechist, not just a mom, but as a catechist in the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. Because the focal point, particularly for the littlest ones, the 3 to 6 year olds, in the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd is the Good Shepherd, an experience of getting to know Christ as the Good Shepherd. So they begin to work, their first introduction to the Good Shepherd aspect of it. They're introduced to the whole of the Mass, to the liturgical calendar, to the colors, to the altar, to baptism. All of it is introduced to them. But there's one particular work that is really the core in the level 1 atrium, which is a 3 to 6 year old, which is the Good Shepherd. Should have got it out of my loft. But our atrium had to shut because of COVID, and now all the work's up in my loft. Otherwise, I would have had this for you, where they are introduced and the scriptures read to them about Christ being the Good Shepherd who takes the sheep out and leads them in and calls them each by name, right? So they work with this for a year, age 3, age 4, and then as they get a little bit older, getting on towards 6, they're introduced to a corollary work, a sort of moving on work, which has the same round green sheepfold. But this time, what you have on that in the sheepfold is an altar, a miniature altar with a miniature paten and a miniature chalice and a miniature Good Shepherd. And the children are introduced to the idea that this person, the Good Shepherd, who leads the sheep in and out, draws them into this other sheepfold, and then it's the Good Shepherd who's there present on the altar. And you take out the Good Shepherd and you put the paten and the chalice there. They get the sense, who is it who is present to us here? Who is it? it's Christ, the Good Shepherd, who's present, really present to us on the altar. So there's this encounter then for the child who goes through this to experience the Mass as a place where you meet the one who knows you and calls you by name, which I think is very beautiful. So that resonance of the Good Shepherd, I thought that just brought all of that back to me. I thought this is why I love the Catechism of the Good Shepherd, because it does so much to enable the children to experience God in this way, to experience Christ in this way, as the one who knows you by name, the one who leads you. The second thing that I appreciated about what she said was talking about it not being a performance. And I think this is one of the things that ad orientem, right? No matter whether it's English or Latin, whatever, helps. It's easy, I think, to get the sense that what's happening up there on the altar, what's happening up there is somehow being performed for us. We're watching, and that the action is up there and not here. That's not what's happening, but I think it's easy for us to fall into that sense of like, oh, well, this is just happening. I think the sense in which I thought, well, reflect on that a little bit. There is a sense in which there's a performance happening. There's a drama that's going on, but in no sense is that a drama that's being, portrayed by actors up there, and we're just the audience being entertained by it. But that there's a scripted and choreographed participation of everyone in the Mass. Everybody participates. So it's definitely not a performance for us. And it's not teaching. The Mass is, we do have a lot to learn, and I'll say something about what I've called liturgical catechesis. The liturgy does teach us a lot, but not in a didactic place. It's not the place for teaching. One of my favorite books about this is here. There you go. I love Zoom because I have my whole library behind me. It's Maria Montessori's book, The Mass Explained to Children. And I can type it in the chat when I'm done. And one of the things she says in the couple of books that she's written about children and the Mass is that the children do need to know the names of things. Children do need to know what's happening. And she's, of course, writing in the context of, pre-Vatican II. This book was written in the 1930s, I think. So she's thinking in a time where the children would not have had any idea what was going on. They weren't going to understand Latin. She said, this is great. They're perfectly primed, actually, to take it all in. But the Mass is not the time to teach them about these things. They need to be taught about it outside of Mass. So we wouldn't want to learn about the different names of positions and moves in ballet while we were either participating in or watching a ballet. There's something else that's going on there. So the teaching kind of happens outside of that. Yeah, I'll stop there because I see, my time is getting on and there's a lot more to say. And I'll return to the question of dance class in a moment. But here I want to just pause for a moment and reflect on the idea of understanding in the context of the Mass, because thinking about Maria Montessori and the way that she writes about it kind of does press us into thinking about what does it mean for us to understand what's happening at Mass. What Maria Montessori thought was not that children understood what was happening at Mass, but that they could engage with it in a particular way because of their imagination, because of the place they are in their lives. And I'll speak a bit about that in a moment. Ooh. That's fun. I'm not sure where that came from, but it's lovely. So first I want to talk about my intergenerational experience of having interviewed my father in the 1990s, when my dad really wasn't going to Mass at that time. He just wasn't interested. And it took him a very long time, I think, to come to terms with the fact that the Mass didn't look like it did when he was a child. He grew up in an Italian-American kind of neighborhood in Ohio, where the sort of all of family life, they all went to Catholic school. Family life sort of centered on being Catholic. What did he do on Sundays? Went to Mass. His friends were there. After Mass, they would all go off and spend the day together. It was just a part of his life growing up. And when I interviewed him and talked to him about the difference, that he perceived, because he was away and he came back from France and it seemed like everything was changing for him. And what he thought was lost was mystery. He never once said anything about, not having understood, anything about that. He wasn't worried about not having understood. And he never complained about the Mass having been in Latin, even though he said somewhat wistfully that he'd never been able to serve on the altar because he couldn't memorize the Paternoster. There's a sort of wistfulness about that, but he didn't complain about that. He just sort of thought, well, that was what it was. And he said, I don't want to go and shake hands with my neighbor. I don't want to, I go there for the mystery, for the reverence, for experiencing God in a particular way. I'm glad to say that he now goes and he participates in his you know, or at least he did when he could get around a little bit more. He's quite frail now, but he was part of their perpetual adoration, and he goes to Mass, and he's all back into it now. But it was a really difficult time for him, and I feel that very much for him. That sense of this isn't what I understood to be important about the Mass seems to have been lost. And so that's one dimension of my kind of familial experience of it. A second dimension of my familial experience of it is that not only am I a mum, but I have a daughter who's now 20 years old who has Down syndrome. And her experience of the Mass, I can remember she was just learning how to talk a bit. And she would say, "Is," at the piece, "Is." You know, so she's been around the Mass since she was very tiny, you know, obviously since she was born. She had heart surgery when she was 4 months old. And the last thing we did as a part of her pre-op appointment was to take her to the hospital chapel where she was baptized. We needed to get that done. So she's always been around. But what does she experience? What does she know? What does she understand about the Mass? I can't say. She couldn't really tell you, but I can tell you two things that are really significant to me in reflecting back over her experience of the Mass and what she understands about what's happening at Mass. The first is she did make her first Holy Communion when she was 10. We have a son who was at that time 8 and agreed that they should do it together. We had lots of conversations about this. Well, she doesn't understand. I said, well, I don't understand. My husband also is a historical theologian, so we had these arguments in the kitchen about it. But she might understand better. I said, I don't, yeah, I won. So she went and did her first Holy Communion. And the week before, I wasn't there, but she was in children's liturgy with Andy Doyle will remember this, Andy, if you're there, because this was at St. Cuthbert's in Durham. The person doing children's liturgy was saying, well, they've gone around because the children were going to make the first communion next week and asked them, what does it mean to you? What does communion mean to you? And Anna doesn't always speak when she's spoken to. You may not get a response from her. You might get a little smile. And on that occasion, she spoke. She said, the Holy Spirit. I thought, okay, well, something's happening here because I don't, you know, you could give different answers, but that's a pretty good answer. The other thing I think that stands out when I think about Anna and her spiritual experience and what she experiences in the Mass is that I think she makes the connection very well, even though she didn't get to go through Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, between that caring presence and what happens at Mass. So Anna's favorite psalm antiphon from Compline is, you, Lord God, are slow to anger, abounding in love, from Monday Compline. Her favorite. She probably doesn't remember any of the others. But she'll say, if she's asked, you want to say Compline, she says, bounding in love. And one morning we were walking up to the steps to Mass, and she turned to me and she said, bounding in love. And I said, indeed. That's why we're here, you know, bounding in love. So she understands something about what's happening. And I think if anyone that I know of is slow to anger and bounding in love, it would be Anna. She's very much like that. And I think in some ways, and this would take a lot of unpacking, she's a better Christian than I am. I think she is. The third thing that I wanted to say, now there's sort of anecdotal, what does it mean to understand things? Also happened at St. Cuthbert's Church in Durham a very long time ago when my son, who's now 15, going on 16, was 3 years old. And we were back at the very back. I mean, we were in the porch. We weren't even in the main part of the church because this little boy would not sit still. I used to joke when he was a little bit smaller that his spiritual gift was falling asleep during the liturgy of the word so that I could concentrate during the Eucharist. But he was watching as the priest held up the consecrated host. And he turned to me and said, that's the big Christ. He said to me, you're going to get the little Christ. And I thought, Yeah, well done. And it was interesting to me. So here's a 3-year-old's vision, and all this little boy did was go to mass and run around. But he was there regularly, and he recognized that something was happening, something extraordinary was happening. Yeah, that's not ordinary food, that's Christ. And you're going to receive Christ. There's something extraordinary. And I always think, you know, whatever anyone says, I should just taken him up just then and said, right, you should receive now. But, you know, not in our form. So I think what that says to me, and what I want to say about those sorts of things, is that the Mass, old form, new form, is full of clues to the nature of what's going on if we pay attention. And I think particularly if we pay attention in the ways that are maybe less focused on understanding and more focused on encounter and reverence. You know, I think it's no accident that when I think about what is happening at Mass, some of the best interpreters for me of the Mass are my son when he was 3 and my daughter who has Down syndrome. They interpret to me, they help me to see what's happening at Mass. And I do think that there's a kind of liturgical catechesis, and I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that in a sec, a way in which the liturgy teaches us, but the words are only part of the teaching. And that's appropriate, given that when we come to Mass, what we come to understand in the Mass is that here we receive Christ, as Ian pointed out to me. Here we encounter mystery, here we encounter God. And all the senses are involved in showing us that something extraordinary is happening here. Something is happening. And the kids, you know, now sadly don't go to Mass nowadays. Why should we go? And I said, well, where else are you going to go on a weekend, you know, on the week to see a miracle happen? Come on, you know. And then I tried, because we've been summoned. No, we haven't. Well, listen carefully, you'll hear. But it's all there. The gestures, the movements, incense, procession, the bells. Our other son said the first time he came into Mass with us, he got to get out of the nursery. This is back in the US. He was 5 years old. So it's time. And he said, he heard the bells. He said, what does that mean? You know, just this sort of sense of something's happening. Something extraordinary is happening here. There are all these clues, right? All these clues. All the senses are recruited, and all the senses should be recruited. And our understanding or lack thereof is not, I think, a prerequisite for the sensory impressions to do their work. I can remember the first time I ever saw a priest hold his fingers together like that. I'd never seen it before. I was at a monastery, so it wasn't a priest who was known to me. And I just thought, that looks very awkward and difficult. What's happening here? But I was curious about it because he was a priest whose reverence in the context of the Mass was extraordinary, like nothing I'd ever seen. And I was there on retreat, and it was all I needed as input, just to be there and listen to Father Sean say Mass. And that conveyed to me, in part, a sense of this reverence, something going on here. And attending Mass in different contexts also suggests to me, as a parent in particular, that fostering reverence and encounter doesn't necessarily depend on old or new, but on a whole set of sense impressions. We took the kids to Mass at Stanbrook, and this is at the point where the boys are teenagers and starting not really to be interested anymore. We walked into Stanbrook Abbey, and if you've ever been to Stanbrook Abbey, you know that when you walk into the chapel, there's this sort of silence and prayerfulness that just rests on you when you walk in the door. And we couldn't even all sit together, and the boys just sat down, and I thought, how is this going to go? It's so quiet here. It went fine. They were quiet and they attended, and there was something about where they were and how it was all taking place. Nice chant, all in English. That happened. And we had a similar experience at the oratory in Oxford, which is a Novus Ordo in Latin. The boys decided they didn't want to sit with us. And they ended up being shepherded through Mass by an elder who just wouldn't take anything from them, no fidgeting, and they sat very still, and that was it. And so I think,
right, okay, I'm just turning something off on my let's just turn me here.
Can we please all mute if we're not Mida, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic. It's okay. I have 4 children. You know, going on without getting interrupted, this never happens, so it's fine. So I think that the senses are essential to drawing us in. I think if we pay attention, we do spot the big Christ. we know that we're in the presence of God. We know that here we encounter mystery. And I didn't have time to trace it up, but there's a story that Jean Vanier in one of his reflections tells about a man who was both blind and deaf, who was very, very agitated at L'Arche, and this was in Trolly, who would call when he was brought into the chapel for Mass. Just, how did he know? He knew he was somewhere else. I think there is something about that presence, right? We know that we encounter mystery. But that's not to say that liturgical catechesis is sufficient. It's not sufficient, because I can see the contrast between my experience and my son's, right? I saw this gesture that I didn't understand, and it deepened my sense of curiosity as well as reverence. And I asked, I found out, I put it together with a whole set of other things that I didn't know anything about at the time. My son, on the other hand, he no longer sees the big Christ, right? He's age 15. He's experienced religious instruction at school. And his imagination has been shaped and changed by a whole lot of other things, right? So that he doesn't even really want to go to Mass. And the pandemic, I could say, has dealt us as a family a huge blow, because part of what it enables you to get them to Mass on a Sunday morning is that we did it last week and we're going to do it next week. This is just what happens on a Sunday. And when you have months and months where it doesn't happen at all, they weren't interested in watching. Blackfriars in Oxford sort of gave a televised, Mass every Sunday. So that was what some of us did, but not all of us. Very hard to get them to come and watch it on TV, and which is fair enough, I think. So our youngest still attends regularly, but mostly I go to Mass and I pray for my children earnestly that they will return to what they all have experienced. But I think that we need to talk more about the Mass, more about what the Mass means, because there is a place for teaching. And here's why I say that, because what I saw, going back to those reflections, was that what people experienced, what they appreciated, what spoke to them in the Mass actually had a lot to do with what they brought in. They brought in a sense of what was happening, particularly with the traditional Latin Mass, extraordinary form, that there was something that they brought in, some expectation that enabled them to have that experience of reverence and encounter. That in my one experience, I'm sorry to say, of going to a Tridentine Mass, I thought, oh, this would be great. And I thought, I have no idea what's happening. I was open to it. I had, but I didn't find it to be that experience that I was expecting, because I wasn't properly prepared. So there is a preparation that goes along with it. I'm willing to try again, and I would like to. Because I think that I also crave that reverence that I'm missing in my current context in my English Mass. So I think that there's a lot to be said. I think Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, again, this is a way that children are prepared to experience Mass, that we need to know what it is that we are expecting, right? So Lumen Gentium tells us that when the faithful share the Eucharistic sacrifice, the source and culmination of Christian life, they offer the divine victim and themselves with him. Now, if we all went to Mass with that sense that that was what was happening, this is the source and culmination of Christian life. In this Mass, I am a part of offering the divine victim, and I also am offering myself. And having that deeper understanding would help, no matter which translation, whether we're doing it ad orientem or in Latin or in English, that knowledge that we have about what's happening and our own preparation for what's happening is essential, I think, for those of us in this room to really get all that's to really receive all that's being given to us. I think in the ancient church, you had the Mass of the catechumens and the Mass of the faithful, right? So the catechumens went out before the Eucharist and were prepared for it. And then after, once they had received it, then they went, and there was a period of mystagogy, where further, deeper education, teaching about what was happening in the Mass happened. And we've sort of lost that, I think, particularly the tradition of mystagogy. Once having been involved in RCIA, sort of once once they've received, they sort of all trickle away. And that kind of post-Easter mystagogical phase is less well attended, let's just say, less well attended. But I would still, and this is where I'm going to conclude and give us some time for conversation, I would still want to push back against the idea that teaching about the Mass is about understanding what happens. Teaching about the Mass, I think, is pushing us deeper into mystery. So Gustavo Gutierrez has said that talk about God is talk about a mystery. And I think that talk about the Mass also is talk about a mystery. And I think we all need to keep this in mind, whether we attend a traditional Latin Mass or the Novus Ordo, whether it's in Latin, whether it's in English, whether we're theologians or priests or catechists or faithful layfolk. We grow in our understanding of the Mass, but the mystery remains. And that's what draws us ever deeper, I think, into the love and life of God. Thank you.
Mida, thank you so much. So refreshing. And I love your ending with mystery, because, yes, sometimes we want to make things too simple and then actually we don't see, do we? So thank you very much. I'm sure there's a lot of, I can already see a round of applause there from somebody. I'm sure there might be some thoughts and questions. So does anybody have any questions or comments for Mida? If they would like to raise their hand or wave or type it in the chat, please. Yeah, Janet, please.
Thank you, Mida. That was immensely rich and really helpful. I've got all sorts of things buzzing around. I mean, I'm somebody who grew up in the pre-Vatican II church. And one thing that needs saying is that pre-Vatican II liturgy was often ghastly. It was dreadful. I mean, my late husband remembers the parish priest in his parish who managed to say Mass in 15 minutes. And prior to the consecration, he hoisted up his alb and took snuff. You know, the view that the pre-Vatican II liturgy was all wonderful. It was great when it was great, just as the Novus Ordo liturgy is great when it's great. And I've been in it, not so much in irreverent Novus Ordo masses actually, but more in well, not very reverent, you know, rapid pre-Vatican II. But I think what we need, all of us need, is something that happens that changes us as we grow up. And I've got one thing that is pre-Vatican II. It was Father Dominic at Spode House, and which was a Dominican retreat center. And there was a group of us there. We were young Christian students, and we at Mass. There was a big staircase, and there was a table, and we were able to stand around the table, and at the point of communion, we were all girls. We all took hands with the girl next to us, and I never forgot that. So it brought together the encounter with Christ, but also the being in community, that we were doing this together. A second anecdote is about English. When the English was being introduced, I was talking to my mother, who was a pious frequently, always going to mass, etc. She brought us up, and she said, "Oh, darling, I can understand it being in English, but not the consecration, not communion." Afterwards, I said to her, "How did you find it?" She said, "I've always known what the words meant because I had a missal, but when he said to me the body of Christ, it meant something to me in a way that it had never done before." They're just anecdotes, but
no, that's really helpful. That's really helpful, because I think that it's something that happens in us, isn't it? And your late husband taught me a long time ago when I was at Duke. Yeah, a very long time ago.
I love it.
Yeah, so it was lovely to see you on here. Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, it is. It's something that happens in us and to us, and it's one of the reasons actually that I have hope in praying for my children, even though they're not there, because I know that that God is still there, that God is still with them, and it is less dependent on language. It's less dependent on even our understanding. It does depend on those little things, that where we're touched, or taking hands, or hearing someone say "body of Christ," and there's something that happens. So the Holy Spirit, right, happens.
Yes, but the other thing that you touched on, talking about children, I mean, our son does not practice. He would not be married in a Catholic church. And it is an intellectual thing that he can't accept. He can't accept the whatever you call it, what do you call it? The Catholic faith is the only faith. I don't know. I can't remember the theological term. And I think every Catholic mother has a great devotion to St. Monica.
St. Monica, yeah.
Because but I mean, they do have to make. They can accept things when they're very small, but when they reach the age when they begin to ask the serious intellectual questions, and when they're just so much more exposed to the culture, and this is something that we haven't licked. I mean, this is a real problem that our young people are going. Flying out of the church.
Yes, I think one of the worst things that's happened to our other son was that he decided to do RE at A level at a Catholic school.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Yes.
So.
Perhaps we should have a conference about RE as well. But thank you very much, Janet. And I'm going to come back to this, but actually the witness of Catholics who actually grew up before Vatican II, I think is incredibly precious. I will actually be speaking to this later, so thank you. We've now got in the chat a comment from Mary Stella. Maybe, so thank you for your very rich talk. It has raised many thoughts for me. I too noticed the Ad Orientem testimony because I had this experience during a Byzantine Mass, during which the priest usually stands Ad Orientem, and I suddenly have this feeling that with him standing Ad Orientem, he was praying with us, and this praying as community came from the presence of Christ among us. We had just had a Eucharistic procession, and the combination of incense and chant gave me the feeling of Christ present among us, and in his presence we were praying. Yeah, so I wondered, Media, if you've got any thoughts on that.
That's really beautiful. I think that the one thing that I didn't kind of go back to about that, the response, the reflection on being Ad Orientem, was the idea that it reminds me of dance class. That sort of, and I just had this immediately, I could see this, the person who's in front is leading with their back to you so that you know what to do. And there's a sense that you're all kind of moving together, and a sense of what the way that you're being led is as much to do with movements and gestures as it is to do with words, and the sense of being a community. You're all doing the same thing, looking the same direction, doing the same movements. that I think does contribute to that sense of community. But that's a beautiful reflection. And I think it also does kind of remind us again that there's something that's happening, that happens particularly for you, that's the Holy Spirit kind of moving, drawing your attention to particular things and inspiring that kind of a reflection, that kind of an experience that everyone who was there wouldn't have necessarily had that same experience. But wouldn't it be great if we had a forum in which after Mass, instead of just, gossiping over coffee, we would talk about things like that, I years ago when I was at St. Cuthbert's and wonderful Father Ben was there, I wrote for our parish newsletter a series on various bits of the Mass. I said, we don't really understand what the Mass, we don't really talk about this. I said, why don't we have a series of reflections about the parts of the Mass, where they, how old they are, where they come from, anything, just those sorts of things. So I did one on the Gloria. I did one on, started with one on the Creed, did one on the Gloria. I did one on the Sanctus. And my idea was, wouldn't it be great if because everybody reads the newsletter, you've got a few paragraphs, everyone reads that. And then what if it's, then we're all paying attention to the same bit of the Mass on that day. And there might just happen that we're struck by something and then we speak to each other about it after Mass over coffee. To my knowledge, it didn't happen, but that was a sort of, I just thought we need to talk about this more. We need to be more aware of what it is, where these words come from that we're saying. This is an English Mass, obviously. We need to know where these words come from that we're saying. Who knows how long the Sanctus has been around and when it started being chanted in Latin, and it's just that sort of thing I think is just so lacking in our parishes, that we just don't talk about what's happening in the Mass. And there's not a deep level of spiritual kind of communion outside of that moment. And you look around, and I would sometimes look around at Mass at St. Cuthbert's and just thinking, this is such an intimate setting. There's this intimacy of each member of the body of Christ and Christ. And there also, then it follows that there's an intimacy, or ought to be, amongst the members of the body, because we are the members of the one body, but we don't talk about that. We're very reserved. And it's not just being in the British Catholic Church, it's true in the US as well, that there's a sort of reserve, we don't want to talk, we don't want to open up to one another about that kind of the depth of our experience of spiritual life. And we should. I'm just receiving there's another comment in there. Oh.
Thank you. Yes. So Clarissa, would you, I read out Mary Stella's, but really, because I think it's the issue with the translation channel, but would you like to speak that question, Clarissa?
Oh, fair enough.
Oh, you're in the library. Okay, fair enough. So I'll read it out then for Clarissa. So she says, read Janet's sharing, and then Roberta, we've got you as well. Read Janet's sharing. I too have a very striking childhood memory around age 10 maybe, of a school Mass when we, the children, were invited to come up and stand around the altar during the consecration. And I have never forgotten that sense of being invited into the mystery. It's interesting to me how very different people's experiences of ad orientem are. When I first experienced it in my 20s, I found it very disorienting and exclusionary. I understand and appreciate what it is meant to convey. I just wonder if part of the difficulty and disagreements about the liturgy have partly to do with our very individual somatic memories and the ways gestures mean differently to us based on our very different experiences of the language of gesture, liturgical and non-liturgical, across our lifetimes. Mm-hmm. And not a well worked out thought, but something I'll be thinking about, says Clarissa. So thank you, Clarissa. Any thoughts on that, Mida?
No, just to, it's a very individual experience of being at Mass. I mean, I also found my first experience of ad orientem Mass in the Tridentine Rite sort of disorienting, not necessarily exclusionary, and I also understood what it was meant to convey. And I think I went in thinking, yeah, this this is how the priest represents us, speaks on our behalf. We're all praying together. I'm ready for this. And yet it was a difficult. I just thought, I don't think I could do this week in, week out, because there's a sense of which not being used to it. It's very hard work, because you have to bring a lot, And I imagine that if you are routinely like if that's your experience on a Sunday, week in, week out, and even maybe sometimes in the week, then you're able just to focus on the Mass, and not feeling that sort of sense of disorientation. But it is, and it has to do with our own background and our own education, our own what we bring into the Mass is so crucial for what we experience once we get there.
Thank you, Mida. Roberto. Sorry, Roberto, we can't hear you very well. Can you up your sound a bit?
Is that better?
Yes. Much better.
Sorry about that. No, I was just thanking Janet and Clarissa for sharing their views. I found them particularly enlightening, given that I'm a millennial through and through. So I hadn't had much opportunity to reflect on these, on what the liturgy would have looked like prior to the reforms, the liturgical reforms. On the opposite side of the coin, I just wanted to offer my own experience of my friends in their 20s, and I feel like there is a shared desire for orthodoxy that is shared pretty much by everyone I know, and the response is either I'm not getting what I want out of the current liturgy because churches are dominated by 8-year-olds who sing very specific types of hymns, and I don't vibe with it. This is not conducive to my relationship with Christ, and therefore I will leave the church. Or on the other side, I'm going to seek this out in more Orthodox communities, and that's how we have discovered the Latin Rite. So I'm wondering whether those aspects of the reform that have enabled you to have such profound encounters with Christ haven't gone too far in alienating on the other side of the cliff, in alienating the young now or churchgoers in general after the 60s and 70s.
I think there was one other, just in response to that, there was one other phrase that stuck with me that I've meditated on, that I didn't have a chance really to talk about, and that was nothing is superfluous. There was one comment, nothing is superfluous. Every gesture, every word, and this is talking about the traditional Latin Mass. And I thought, that's really beautiful. My husband and I were talking about it actually. He said, but that is the Mass should be, no matter what. And I think our most frequent kind of moan leaving a church where we've been to Mass in English is say the black, do the red. That there seem to be superfluous elements that come in, and you find yourself distracted. Tiny example of me being just really distracted by, and here's where I think that it being always the same and you know what to expect, which someone else mentioned in the reflections, that's very much me. I like knowing what to expect. But we had a priest come in covering for a few weeks, and instead of saying brothers and sisters, he said friends, and it just tripped me up every single time. I thought, but that's not what it says, and it's a silly little thing. But if you look at something like kids with autism, I used to teach at Cranmer Hall here in Durham, and we had a student she had a son with autism, and she had this complicated thing for him with various Velcro bits. So she could show him, and she's a Methodist, right? Show him who was saying what, who was doing what, and what order it was going to be in, because he found it so difficult. And I just said to her, I said, just let him come to Mass with me, because it's the same every time. It's just the same person doing the same sorts of things. He'll find it very, you know, he might find that more conducive for his own worship. So I think there is something in that it's nothing is superfluous, and part of what contributed to my sense of reverence when Father Sean was saying Mass, Sean Finnegan, down at Minster Abbey, was that he very much had that sense of, I'm just doing exactly what it says, and he was so focused on saying Mass, he was so focused on the mystery and the presence that it drew the rest of us in. And I don't think that's to do with the language, and I think he could have done it facing west, facing east, facing the congregation, and he would have conveyed the same thing, because there was something in his demeanor, in the way that he presented. And I think that part of what is lacking, part of what's lacking is that sense of focus and concentration that we have at Mass. There are a lot of other things going on, even at Mass, and it would be nice if we could sometimes leave those out. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know if that speaks to back to you in any way, Roberto, but I appreciate your reflection as well, by the way.
There's a comment here also from Janet about, yes, I don't know if you want to comment on that, Janet, about our responsibility to educate ourselves, to catechize ourselves. Or you're muted, Janet. Sorry.
Sorry. Yes, I mean, sort of going back to the reforms, I think a lot of the problem was that the bishops sort of presented things, and this will happen, and didn't make sure that the priests really catechized and explained what was going on. And so people had the shock of suddenly coming in, and it seemed that everything was changed, and they didn't know why. And I think now, I mean, my late husband, Nicholas, used to say this very often: why on earth do Catholics behave as if they're still at primary school, that they believe because Sister so-and-so told them something when they were 7, they hold the church responsible for this? Why don't they read? Why, if they read the broadsheets, they read, whatever level their education is, why do they not feel some responsibility to educate themselves and not leave it to other people to do it? And I think this is a tremendous problem in a highly educated society. We've got people reading the New Scientist, and not their specialisms, but just in general, and yet they probably never read anything.
Yeah, that was what inspired me to write those little, passages for the bulletin at church. It's just to introduce those sorts of concepts, because people don't necessarily educate themselves, and catechesis, catechesis doesn't stop when you're confirmed or when you receive communion. Yes, thanks for that, Andy. In our parish, St. Cuthbert's in Durham, we did have a number of sessions, he says, following the Sunday morning Mass, to go through the changes being brought in with the new translation of the Mass, now over a decade. Has it been a decade? Wow. People were engaged, but we missed a trick in not following up. Yeah, I mean, it's hard because we're in a society where everyone is really busy. I work 2 jobs and I have 4 children. So, I understand the busyness of life. It's really difficult to kind of add something else in, and I think people are resistant to that and don't. So again, this is why I thought, back of the bulletin, let's just start where there's a space. There is a space, there's a tiny little opening. You pick it up, you read it, and maybe, this is sort of just picking away at that, just the beginning of trying to get some education, some information into people's hands, and just to point people in that direction, because we do. I mean, we deserve to know what's happening. I think all Catholics should be more aware of what's happening, And yeah, if you figure out how to follow up with that now, Andy, I would love to hear about it. That would be great. It's hard. It's hard trying to start a Catechesis of the Good Shepherd atrium. I mean, you would think 3 to 6 year olds, you know, a bit of, it's very difficult to find the space, to find people who are willing to do it. I have all the materials. The hardest thing about an atrium is making all the materials. If you know anything about Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, it's all Montessori materials. I've got all the materials. I've done the training. I need space and I need a priest who's willing to support it. And that's it. But it's, you know, it's just not happening. It's very, I find it very challenging, because I think my kids particularly would have benefited, especially my two with dyslexia, would have benefited a lot from that. They responded well to Montessori when they were at a Montessori school in the States. And that was an important part of it for us. And I thought if we could bring that back with us, that would be great. I wanted them to get to know the Good Shepherd. And I don't think that they really got to know the Good Shepherd in the way that they were catechized in school. I was able to take my little one up to Newcastle, where there were missionaries of charity who were running an atrium. So we went up. They said, will you come and help? And I said, if I could bring my child. So she's had a little bit more of that. But I think it's really important, especially for children now growing up, to encounter first the Good Shepherd as the one who knows them and calls them by name. And it's very specifically for Montessori, a pre-moral awareness that they first encounter God in this way, as the one who gives light, and that their responses are so sort of just gratitude is where they start. So I think we need to learn more. I think we need to do better for the children. And I think the whole idea of the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, and the thing that draws me to it, is that you provide the space for the children to encounter God, and then they lead you.
Thank you very much, Mida, and everybody who's contributed today. We're coming up to lunchtime. I'm sure you didn't need me to tell you that. So thank you all for your participation this morning. We, and again, you know, for regrouping so well done. Thank you, Mida, for making us think so deeply, particularly from the perspective of families and children. I think we're sort of starting to get a bit more of a sense of what happens in liturgy, that it is these words, but it's not just these words. There's a lot more happening. So we're going to gather again at 1:45 or 2:45 in continental Europe. To conclude, and maybe to begin our lunch, we are again going to have a hymn to the Holy Spirit, this time from the Taizé community. So just give me a moment to sort out my sound.